So this is the 6th video on the Shroud of Turin, and this is the historical sketch. After this section is the last section, which is the apologetic part. So it's almost done. Thank you for those who are watching and actually considering this. I really appreciate it. So this is part 5, the historical sketch. The last video went over the anatomy of the shroud, of the man on the shroud, and showed that there was practically a perfect correlation with the man Jesus Christ, and that whether or not one believes the shroud is authentic or not, or whether or not one believes in the historicity of Jesus or not, the shroud is probably depicting Christ. It's really the only reasonable conclusion to infer. So anyway, part 5, a historical sketch. Knowing both the anatomy of the image as well as some of the facts I had covered in part 1, we can with some strength start to infer that perhaps, as absurd and impossible it might seem, that the Shroud of Turin actually is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. However, to add some more plausibility to this notion, I'd like to quickly sketch what a historical reconstruction of the shroud's journey would look like. We have a recorded history since the 14th century thanks to the Diocese Memorandum. However, there is no truly solid mention of the shroud from any time before that. There is, though, many hints and clues along the way. Just to quickly point out, there is a blogger, one who does a lot of historical research into the shroud, because what I'm going to be doing is touting Ian Wilson's reconstruction. His name is Yannick, and he takes issue with Ian Wilson. He doesn't think Ian Wilson's construction is correct. That being said, Yannick still believes in the veracity of the shroud, and he has his own theories. It's just worth noting that this is not the only reconstruction theory out there. To me, personally, whether Ian Wilson's right or whether Yannick's right doesn't really matter, because either way, both come to the same conclusion that the shroud is Christ's, which really, for me, is the important part, and is the important part for what we're doing here. But anyway, let us begin with Easter. Why didn't the disciples mention this image-bearing shroud? Wouldn't this be powerful proof in the face of the Pharisees and Sadducees that Jesus Christ really was the Messiah of Israel, and that he had risen from the dead? Why keep it a secret? Thoughts similar to these were written by John Calvin during the Reformation as proof that the shroud was just another fake Catholic relic, one used to dupe the masses into heresy and idolatry. The problem with such thinking is that it is ultimately an argument from silence. Just because the apostles were silent about the image doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't know about it or that the shroud isn't the shroud of Christ. Firstly, the Gospel accounts do not include everything that happened in Jesus' life. As is written in the Gospel according to St. John, and many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. And there are also many other things that which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Amen. And that's John 20:30-31 and 21:25. And then here I was using the King James Version. A little side note. In fact, the Gospels never even give a thorough description of what Jesus looked like. They are utterly silent on most of Jesus' life before his ministry, and do not mention much about the 40 days after his resurrection before Pentecost. In fact, there are good reasons as to why the disciple... Pentecost is 50. Sorry, this stupidity on my part. In fact, there are good reasons as to why the disciples would not have revealed such a miracle. I just want to correct this for my own sake. I should be saying 40 days until Ascension, if I'm remembering correctly. Pentecost happens after Ascension. Duh, I should know this from the liturgical cycle of the Orthodox Church, but you know, hey. Firstly, the image may have developed over time, meaning they would not have noticed it on Easter morning. Image formation theories such as Raymond and Rogers' Maillard reaction would be compatible with such a hypothesis. Secondly, they may have just been too overwhelmed from the appearances of Christ coupled with the empty tomb to be pondering the image. Thirdly, if the apostles started to go around and preach while using the shroud as evidence, it would be incredibly easy for authorities to seize and destroy the relic. Yet despite all this, all 4 Gospel accounts do in fact remark about his burial shroud, and that it was made of linen, just like the Shroud of Turin is. The word used in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sindon, need not only refer to burial cloths, but a general linen cloth as well, which when the cloth is described by St. John as having been rolled up, poses no contradiction between the Gospel accounts and the shroud. Furthermore, even though John said he saw the sudarion which had been over his head, the word he used for over, epi, doesn't necessarily mean that it had to cover only Christ's head, but that it could have covered his entire body as well, which is reinforced with what the Jewish code of law mandated, that one who had blood pour forth from his wounds would be wrapped in a sovev, a cloth that would wrap an entire body in the same way that the shroud could. Finally, there are mentions of the burial cloth of Christ in 2nd century non-canonical works such as the Gospel of Hebrews, the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of Pilate, the Acts of Nicodemus. and the Acts of Nicodemus. While certainly these works may contain many things which are not historically and doctrinally accurate, they do provide evidence that an attempt to preserve the Shroud of Jesus, however conflicted the accounts may be, was known by the 2nd century. In 5th century Edessa, Byzantine Emperor Justinian began a large reconstruction effort after the most recent flood had killed 30,000 citizens and leveled several major churches. During such a holy relic was discovered inside a wall, a cloth which depicts the face of whom is presumably to be Jesus Christ. It is quickly called the Akiriropitos, not made with hands, again, pronunciation. Contemporary accounts list the image as being on a sindon or a tetradiplon, which means doubled in 4. This latter point is important, as Ian Wilson has showed that if the shroud is doubled in 4 only, the head would be showing, just like in all icons which depict the image of Edessa. But how did this image, not made with hands, if it is the shroud, ever get to Edessa from Jerusalem? There is a tradition that Akbar V, king of Edessa, sent for Jesus when he fell fatally ill. Instead of going to the king, Jesus pressed a cloth to his face which left an imprint, and was taken to Akbar by the apostle St. Thaddeus. Presenting the image to him, Akbar was healed and along with the members of the court were converted. This all supposedly happened the same year that Jesus was crucified. Skepticism is understandable here, as the only accounts we have date far after 30 AD. The story itself is related in the 4th century church history work of Eusebius, and historians doubt the mass conversion story of Akbar V due to any lack of independent verification, though it doesn't help that many documents and annals were destroyed by Islamic invasions and takeover of the city. However, we do know that Christianity existed in Edessa by the end of the 2nd century, and at the beginning of the 3rd for a few reasons. Firstly, a passage in the Chronicle of Edessa, which dates to the year 201 AD, speaks of a flood that destroyed many parts of the city, including the nave of the Church of the Christians. Secondly, coins issued by Akbar VIII have an unmistakable Christian cross on the top of the emperor's crown, a sign that Akbar was open about his Christianity during the reign of Emperor Commodus. This places the date of the coins no later than 192 AD, since that is the year Emperor Commodus died. Thirdly, there is a stone lion with a Christian cross on its head in Salaerfa's present-day museum. The Syriac word for lion, Aryu, was the name of Edessa's ruling dynasty that ended in 215 AD when the Romans took over the city. These dates are well beyond St. Thaddeus' death though, and while all of this is intriguing, it doesn't do much in showing that the shroud was in Edessa before its supposed rediscovery in the 6th century. However, the Akbar tale may contain a kernel of truth. Edessa lies 180 miles to the east of Antioch, on a direct trade route no less. Compare this to the journeys of St. Paul, who traveled 500 miles west to Ephesus, a further 500 miles to Malta, and eventually even making it to Rome. With such great distances traveled in the Church's early years, the evangelization of Edessa is by no means a stretch. Furthermore, the small neighboring kingdom of Adiabene has a lineage of bishops that could be dated back to the year 104 AD, with Bishop Bakita being the first, ordained by none other than St. Thaddeus himself. Hence, during this time, the shroud very well may have been brought to Edessa, since the surrounding areas had already been evangelized, and we know that there were churches in the 2nd century Edessa. But what about its disappearance? Like many other places throughout early Christianity, Christians in Edessa were persecuted for their faith. It would be during these times that Christians in Edessa would have hidden the image so it wouldn't have been destroyed, especially if the pagans were looking for it, as the 10th century history from Mount Athos' story of the image of Edessa seems to imply. But how do we know that the image of Edessa even looks anything remotely like the Shroud of Turin? To answer this, we need only to look at the drastic iconographic changes in the depiction of Christ that began around the time of the image's rediscovery in Edessa. Many of the earliest icons of Jesus showed him as a clean-shaven, innocent youth, but by the 6th century there was a sudden change. Jesus was now depicted as we have come to classically see him, a man with long hair and a beard. More telling, however, is the fact that his eyes were depicted as abnormally large and ovate, which is what we would expect if the icons were being based off the shroud. Such a connection between Byzantine icons and the shroud was first noted by Vignon in his book The Holy Shroud of Turin vs. Science, Archaeology, History, Iconography, and Logic. Here Vignon discovers that 80% of the hundreds of icons he studied had a peculiar mark between the eyes, a V with a rectangular box resting on top of it. There were further resemblances: no ears, no neck, no shoulders, a forked beard, a truncated mustache, straight nose, enlarged nostril, one raised eyebrow, a line across the throat, bruised forehead, abnormally shaded or swollen cheeks. Hence, from this drastic correlation between Byzantine icons and the Shroud of Turin, we can infer that the image of Edessa and the Shroud are indeed the same object, or at least that it is a possibility. The image was eventually brought to Constantinople in the year 944 AD by the orders of the Emperor Romanus Lecapenus. Interesting, again a pronunciation. Interestingly, in some accounts of the image's triumphant march throughout the city, it is referred to as a shroud. Further references as such appear in 1142 when Ordericus Vitalis relates the Akbar story but refers to the image of Edessa as exhibiting the likeness and extent of the body of the Lord rather than just his face. Gervase of Tilbury also discusses an alleged letter Jesus sent to Akbar saying, "I send you a cloth in which the figure of my face and my whole body are contained." Regrettably, both Vitalis and Gervasi are generally considered by most medieval historians to be gossipers, though this doesn't rule them out as fragmentary references. However, in 1150, one of Constantinople's listed prizes is none other than a shroud, which is also supported by the account of an anonymous English pilgrim who listed the shroud as one of the treasures in the emperor's chapel. Even earlier than both of these accounts is a sermon by 8th century Pope Stephen III, though the copies we have date between the 9th and 12th centuries. The passage in question may have been added long after the Pope's death, but it nevertheless refers to the image as being one on which the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his whole body was so divinely transformed that it was sufficient for those who could not see the Lord bodily in the flesh to see the transfiguration made on the cloth. Furthermore, Byzantine liturgical cloths called epitaphi, I think, whose copies we have date from the 13th century, depict a dead Christ whose position is exactly the same as it is of the Shroud of Turin. In 1201, Father Nicholas Mezaridis wrote on one of the Bucolian chapels as relics, which was presumably the Shroud of Turin. He writes, "In this chapel Christ rises again, and the dawn with the burial linens is clear proof. The burial shrouds of Christ, these are of linen. They are of cheap and easy-to-find material, still smelling of myrrh and defying decay, since they wrap the outlineless, fragrant with myrrh, naked body after the Passion." Though Father Nicholas says that the linen is cheap and easy to find, this is easily chalked up to the fact that he, like many others even of present day, was not an expert in the field of linen weaving and thus probably concluded that the linen was just any other kind of linen rather than the expensive 3-to-1 herringbone twill that I have discussed earlier. In 1204, the year in which Constantinople was sacked, chronicler Robert de Clary wrote that he had seen the Shroud of Christ in the city and that it had the imprints of Christ's entire body on it. However, soon after, the shroud disappears from history until the Diocese Memorandum in 1356. What most likely happened to the shroud is that it was stolen during the sack of Constantinople and brought back west by the Knights Templar. There's also, I think, the Hungarian Prey manuscript, which I know Stephen Jones, a blogger on the Shroud of Turin, has done a lot of blog posts on dealing with this relic, the Prey manuscript, and showing how it predates the carbon dating, and he shows all the correlation to the Shroud of Turin with it, and that there's some people who dispute it, but it's another piece of evidence. I don't have it mentioned in this paper, so I figure I'd just throw it out there. There's also the Sidarium of Oviedo, but I'll get to that in a later point after reading all these things. So, there are three pieces of circumstantial evidence which support the idea that the Knights Templar were the owners of the Shroud of Turin. First, in 1307, the King of France arrested Knights Templar leaders and charged them with idolatry, worshipping a mysterious idol in the form of the head of a man with a long reddish beard. Secondly, in old Knights Templar monastery in England, there was discovered a painted head which very well could have been a copy of the idol that the King of France spoke about. The image bears a striking, if not unmistakable, resemblance to the face of Christ on the Shroud of Turin. Thirdly, and most importantly, one of the three Knights Templars leaders, Geoffrey de Charny, was burned at the stake during the many purges of the Templars from Europe. It was 50 years later when Bishop d'Arcis had his run-in with another Geoffrey de Charny, whose widowed wife was displaying the shell publicly. Though their last names have been spelled differently, this is because French was non-standardized during medieval times, just like English, and hence led to numerous ways of spelling Geoffrey's last name. Charny, Charneo, Charneo, and Charniasco. I mean, I have it in the paper. There's a bunch of different ways. It's probably they're all pronounced the same or slightly different. Hence, it is not impossible that the shroud was passed down through this family line. The rest of the shroud's recorded history need not be explained for our purposes, since we are only interested in tracing it back to the 1st century. In other words, I mean, once the Diocese Memorandum comes up, we know what's happened to the shroud since, so it's really, I don't need to go over it. This historical reconstruction is indeed very skeletal. There's much more I could have added in, but such a presentation would warrant a whole lecture if not a series on its own. I do not have the time to do that. If anyone is interested in such a reconstruction, I highly recommend Ian Wilson's book, The Shroud, Solving the 2,000-Year-Old Mystery, and also look at the comment and criticisms by that blogger I mentioned, Yannick. So, Joe Nickel, again, to reference him, commonly says that there's no reconstruction of the Shroud, there's no recorded history. Hopefully this video shows you that, again, that's really a half-truth. There may not be any solid history, but there's a pretty good reconstruction that could be come from. So yeah, until the next video, which I will do probably right now. Thank you again.